I got a call from Frank Marshall from Kennedy Marshall, who's made a tremendous amount of films that I admire. And he discussed with me this idea of doing the story on Johnny Cash, and if I had any feelings towards Johnny, did I connect to the music? And fortunately, I was a huge fan. And I knew the narrative had been explored in books and feature films, but I also knew that there was a lot of catalog that I connected to, a lot of his songwriting that I connected to. And there was a film that I could find that hadn't been explored if I could get access to an archive and also to the family in a way that I could really sit down with them and talk about Johnny the artist. So I came to it with that as my dream and my hope, and I was really lucky with this film because I discovered about 60 hours of unreleased Johnny Cash discussing his life with an author in preparation for a book. Audio cassettes that arrived by pure luck. And in an interview, someone mentioned, Patrick Carr mentioned that he had some audio tapes of Johnny, and we followed up on it and recut the whole movie because Johnny Cash was suddenly there in the cutting room and Johnny Cash could tell his story. So as a filmmaker, it's a bit of a dream come true because you always hope to find either an archival clip or an audio recording that is unheard and has not been seen. And this was the gold mine because it was Johnny Cash being able to deliver his story. Working with the estate, I was able to digitally transfer all the tapes and have transcripts made and poured through the transcripts and found new ideas, but also was able to replace some of the things that a writer might say. And there's nothing better than to hear the musical voice of Johnny Cash describing his childhood as opposed to a writer taking on the persona of defining what his childhood was. That was a game changer for the film. When you have Johnny Cash saying that he connected to music, or Johnny Cash saying anything, comes across really in a beautiful way. And having these archival recordings gave it this mythic quality because it wasn't a studio soundbite. It wasn't a radio show. It wasn't a TV interview. You ended up with Johnny Cash in a place where he was having conversations with someone he trusted and really examining his life. And that for me was the key to making the film and editing. I think the things that I learned about Johnny Cash in making this film was that everyone has a Johnny Cash they can attach themselves to. And you might come to it from the spiritual side where someone from a different generation might connect to the gospel sound, but another person might connect to Rick Rubin sessions. Johnny Cash covered so many different chapters in his life that his legacy really lives on in that way that you can go to him at different points in your life with different feelings. And the beauty of his message was this sense of hope and a struggle with the ideas of dealing with his own failings. And it comes across in all the musical genres that he encountered. Johnny Cash's country, Johnny Cash's rock, Johnny Cash's R&B, the gospel sound. There's so many different ways to step into the music. And I think that's what makes him a complex character, but also gives the legacy such depth and gives you an opportunity to check into his narrative and also his music on many different levels and many different forms of music. It's a great question. A lot of the things I came across in this film was a lot of things I came across in the film that made it a unique experience was how to handle going to the place of telling a story that some people might be familiar with and not playing into the myths that have been repeated. The idea of Johnny and June in 1968 getting married and life carried on. Really taking on those myths head on without it being salacious. So both with the film about Elvis Presley and the film of Johnny Cash, you have certain references to their history, and what you look for are the details that are lost, the storylines that get buried. And a lot of times it deals with race, or a lot of times it deals with things that really demonstrate the artistic struggle. when you think about Johnny Cash and the TV show, the idea that he would have so many contemporary artists on his show, or that the idea that he was bringing all different types of artists onto the show, that gets sometimes lost in the narrative. And those are the details you look for. Working with Bruce Springsteen and then also working on this film about Johnny Cash, I recognize my connection to it by that I see them as a songwriter and writers that I'm fascinated with, and their use of language, and also how writing is used in their life to explore different themes. So there's a lot of similarities in looking and admiring these artists and how they express themselves through the written word. And I think a lot of people don't think about Johnny Cash that way. But the beauty for me was Johnny Cash's poems and his songwriting. So there are similarities in looking at Johnny Cash and Bruce in that way, that for a filmmaker, you're chasing interesting stories and you try to learn in the process. And both with my work with Bruce Springsteen and the work on this documentary, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about these artists, and I love to keep the music and their artistic journey as the focus. I think the beauty of looking back at Johnny's work and using it in a documentary was that it gave me this opportunity again and again to see that he was a man who relied on a faith and an honesty about his own weaknesses, an acknowledgement of it, and also the power of faith that gave him the chance to reconnect and start again. And I think that was a powerful message to be making the doc in that moment, in this time where there was a form of honesty about his own failings. And that felt great to be part of uncovering that story in a non-salacious way, but also it seemed to fit in for the time where there's a man really looking at himself, his actions, and trying to do better. And Johnny Cash, to me, in his music and his life, explored the light and the dark consistently. And, that made sense for today.